Today, we're looking at some of the most frequent mistakes that painters make and how to fix them. We'll talk about 4 separate miniatures so you can apply various tips and tricks to your own work and push your miniatures to the next level. And we are starting with glow effect. As you might know, all the featured models from this video, including this one, were sent to me for a review. You can also apply for the next miniature review, there will be a link in the description, just enter your email and I'll send you the form. The first model is this Necron monster with the green lightning. Overall, I do think it's painted in a clean way, but the most prominent feature here is the green glow, and that could be improved. The biggest problem with the glow is that it's not very light, or at least not light enough when you compare it to the rest. Maybe it might seem like it glows, but when we turn the photo into black and white, you can clearly see that it's pretty much just as light as the rest of the model. So despite being different color, it doesn't work so well. You see, OSL stands for Object Source Lighting, not Object Source Color, but many people treat it as such. The parts that are exposed to the light source should be visibly lighter, so let's see what we can do here. So first, whenever you paint glow effect, it's better to take a photo of it over a black backdrop. This makes sense because whenever we talk about glow effects, there has to be a visible difference between the lit parts and everything else. And the black backdrop here certainly helps. Next, I darkened the entire model just a little bit, so we have some room to make certain parts lighter. And the most important change is this. Bam! Now it looks more glowy. At first, this might look a bit strange because, of course, it's just a quick Photoshop sketch, so let's break it down. As I said in the past, the most important thing when painting glow effect is to make the lit parts lighter than the less exposed parts. If you have multiple light sources, it's a good idea to have them separated by a dark transition in between, so it's more obvious where they are coming from. In this case, we have the green glow, and then of course we have like a more general light coming from the left side. By including those dark transitions, we've easily made everything more obvious. In the original, it almost seems like everything was painted in a standard way, and then the green glow was added at the end with airbrush. It's much better to plan the glow effect way ahead or adjusting the transitions at the end, just like we did here. Honestly, if everyone follows that principle of making the lit parts lighter than the non-exposed parts, we would solve so many problems. And clearly, sometimes it's not about making something brighter and brighter, but maybe darkening the rest. To make it really obvious, just imagine that you're holding a candle. If you hold the candle and go outside into daylight, there will be like no glow from it, because there is no room to make it visible since there is so much light already. But if you go into a dark room with the same candle, suddenly everything will be illuminated by it, because there is no other light source. And to a certain extent, we've done the same thing for this guy. We kinda dimmed the other light, so now the green glow effect is more prominent. Before moving to another mini, I also made the belly and the head more light, so they stand out more. There were some other minor adjustments on the lit parts as well, but as long as you keep the main principles in mind, your glow effect will look more credible. Another miniature, also from 40k, and this time we have more topics to cover. First, let's look at the gold. Usually when you look at anything from gold, you'll see variety of browns, oranges, greens, and ochres. So that's exactly what I added on top here. This is just a simple sketch, so of course you can make it much better, but just look at the chest eagle and look at the weapon and the inside of the armor. Those are the hues that you are looking for. To give you a better idea, I also added some mid-tone swatches on the side, so you have a good reference for some nice gold colors. Besides including more mid-tones, I also included some secondary reflections. A good example is this weapon. I kept the main reflection placement as it is, and then there are subtle hints of more reflections on the inside. And then of course you see a shade that's separating the two reflections. To some degree, you can do this everywhere on Metallix, and for that, your model will look much better. Another edit adjusted his face and some rendering. When you compare the before and after, the face looked very pale, like there is no real color. So I did the following. I included some more saturated browns in the shadows, made the face more clean overall, made the upper cheeks way lighter, and made the eyes much more refined. This is way easier to do in Photoshop, of course, but I would still suggest that you try and adjust his eyes. It really makes a big difference. Remember that the face is the focal point, and as such, it needs more effort. Then, moving further, I cleaned up surface of various bits. For example, I did it for the purple fabric, although it might not be as necessary. But where I do find it necessary is the gray handle. Now, I assume that this is supposed to represent just gray and not metal, because if this was supposed to look metallic, it would need much higher contrast. But I could be wrong. But anyway, you get rid of this patchy finish by layering with full opacity. If you're using layering and you don't have the proper coverage, this might happen. I fully realize that it's a bit tricky around the symbol, but I genuinely think that if you fix it, it'll be way better. And finally, the blade. I assume that this was supposed to be some special power effect or something like that, but I would approach it a bit differently. So instead, painting reflections like these respect the shape of the X much more. And also the lightning that's here on the inside is much more visible. Again, keep in mind this is just a simple Photoshop sketch, you can make it actually so much better in real life. You can kinda see that for the lightning I sketched like broad orange lines, and then inside of that I added lighter colors that are close to white. This is not perfect by any means, but just to give you the general idea, it's good enough. There are more things that you could do for sure, but these ones will move the needle the most. Here it's gonna be faster overall, because I think that many things work here really well. I really like the use of colors, it's very interesting. It's pretty clear that the painter knows that the brightness of the color is more important than its hue, so we can see various hues on the skin as well as on the rest of the model. And still, there are a few things I would tweak. First, let's start with definition. I like that most parts are already recess shaded, but not all of them. The little accessories around his chest could use a little more, just like this. And also the belt could be separated in a cleaner way. Then we have the recess shading around his thighs, and it's the same thing here. I would simply make the black lines thinner. There are also other spots that need more clean recess shading. Like, for example, just look at the before picture of this shoulder right here. So now it's certainly much better. And when you look at the wood and the ropes on top of it, it was the same thing here. There was like no separation whatsoever, or it was like very subtle, and I genuinely think that now it looks better. So the first edit that I made is mostly about definition. In the next edit, I fixed some of the patchiness that's on the skin. When you really zoom in, you can see that roughness over the entire miniature, so I just wanted to make it smoother. Obviously, this is much easier to do in Photoshop, but I would still try to do it. The third edit builds on top of that, and I also adjusted some other details. One frequent mistake that I see people make when painting skin, and especially muscular dudes, is that the muscles are really well separated. This might create the impression that you are painting like armor or something synthetic. Either that or the miniature is super skinny. What I find better is when you try to make the muscle separations more connected to a certain degree. This painter already did that to a certain extent, so it's not like these are super dark separations, but I would connect the muscles even more. Then I cleaned up the gold and also made the shade darker, which actually creates that reflective metallic impression. This is perhaps more obvious on the knee. Just look at the before and after and compare the reflection placement and contrast between the two. And before moving further, I also want to talk about this latex or leather or whatever this is. The thing is, the rendering here is very rough, which is not a problem by itself, but I get the impression that this wasn't intentional rather than something that was planned. So either I would paint it with texture blending, which still creates texture but in a more refined way, or you can just make it smoother. However, once you start applying blot effects on top, it's really difficult to fix it without repainting the entire thing. So that's my opinion here. Of course, I would also do that for the other leg, and maybe I would consider making the blood splatter more subtle. Now, real quick, just a reminder that I recently started my newsletter for people who want to push their miniatures to the next level. If you want to become a better miniature painter, there is a link in the description, so check it out. Here we have another Space Marine. It's gonna be fairly quick because I think that you got most fundamentals right, so let's start with the obvious, which is non-metallic metal. First of all, you are combining non-metallic metal with regular metallics, which is not a problem by itself, but I would really like you to try to paint gold without any metallics. Either way, the blade really needs a different reflection placement. Currently, it almost looks like both sides of the blade are exposed in the same angle, which is not the case. So what I did here is change the reflection placement so it's more asymmetrical. You might recall that GW Studio painters sometimes paint the reflections in a checkboard pattern, and that looks a bit too artificial. So in this case, there is some of that where you repeat the pattern of reflections and shades in between them. But I also added more subtle reflections, like the one you see right here. And that makes for a more credible result. I also edited the gun, so now you can clearly see that there is this reflection running down the middle of the gun barrel. And honestly, since you're already capable of blending and representing volumes just like you did on this cloth, I wouldn't be afraid of doing it everywhere else, since you already know how to do it. And for the exact same reason, I did the same thing on the armor. Instead of just relying on edge highlight, I would paint the shapes and volumes of the miniature so it feels more 3D-like. I also cleaned up the face a bit, but for the most part I wanted to make it much brighter. It almost feels like I mentioned this in every video, but genuinely the face is the first thing you look at, so it needs to be brighter and you should put more effort into it. So just look how I made the cheeks and the forehead brighter. I could also talk about the banner, but honestly, the same stuff applies here, so just try to paint more volumetric highlights. But to get back to the rest, let's look at the third edit. Here I adjusted the helmet so it's more saturated and less dull, and more importantly, I added definition. Look at the armor before and compare it to the adjusted version. Besides adding definition on the green armor, I also defined both of these white symbols. It's totally understandable if you want to keep things more subtle, but you gotta keep in mind that the smaller the details, the more contrast they need. That's the key thing when recess shading. If something is very small, it needs high contrast for it to be readable. This is also the big difference between painting 32mm scale like Warhammer or Kingdom Death, as opposed to painting busts or 75mm minis. The bigger the scale, the less contrast you need. Since these are very small details, I would add more recess shading, which is generally true for separating small elements. And together, I think it creates much better impression. Now, I mentioned painting volumes and making your models feel more 3D-like. So if you wanna push your miniatures to the next level, watch this video next because it'll help you with that. And see you there.